So welcome everyone. This is our monthly Tree Talk speaker series that we've been hosting since last fall. We've done this every second Tuesday, thanks to Georgia Power, who sponsored this series. We've had a wide range of guests speaking on anything and everything related to trees, lots of fun topics. And today we have Sydney Young, who's actually a new staff member of the Savannah Tree Foundation. So just to go over a couple quick housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, so if you're not able to stay the entire time, or if you know someone who wanted to watch and couldn't make it, this will be recorded and uploaded on our YouTube channel later. Please keep your microphones muted for the duration of the talk. We will have time for questions at the end, so if you'd like to ask your question over voice, that's fine at the end. Or if you might forget it, like I do sometimes, feel free to drop it in the chat box and we'll go over them at the end as well. And just a quick staff update that's relevant. So I am the outgoing field manager of the Savannah Tree Foundation. My name is Jake Henry, and I will actually be leaving the Tree Foundation in late August. But Sydney here is our new field manager. So I'll do a little bio on her so you can all meet her. And today she's going to be talking about classifying and identifying tree ID and taxonomy basics. And I think this is going to be a really fun talk. So just a little bit of background for those of you who might not be familiar with who we are. We are the Savannah Tree Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's been around since 1982. Our mission is to protect and grow Chatham County's urban forest through tree planting, community engagement, and advocacy. So we're not planting trees today, but we are doing the other two. So we try to really stay engaged with the community through events like this, and we can advocate for trees and why it's important to learn how to identify them. It's a really great topic. So today's speaker is Sydney Young, as I mentioned, our new field manager. Sydney is originally from the Cajun capital, Lafayette, Louisiana. After receiving her BS in environmental science from Loyola University in New Orleans, she completed an ecology assistantship in Augusta, Georgia. Afterwards, she worked at the Southern Environmental Law Center as a legal assistant before deciding to pursue a Master of Forestry degree at the University of Maine. There, she conducted an urban ash street tree study and created an emerald ash borer preparedness plan for the town of Orono. So lots of really great experience. And now she is happily back in the South and ready to share her tree skills with the community. So we are very excited to have Sydney joining us here at the Tree Foundation. And what I will do is we're actually going to switch over to Sydney now so that she can start her presentation. All right, you should be able to share. Sydney.
All right, I hope everybody can see this. Today, I would like to talk about taxonomy. I'd like to thank you for coming to the talk today. I'm very happy to be with the Savannah Tree Foundation. I'm happy to share my skills, and I'm also very happy to learn from the community as well. Today, I'll be taking a more generalized approach to a couple of topics that are important to understanding plants. And I want to clarify from the beginning that these topics don't always have to be specific to academia or even those that work with plants all the time. If you just like to garden or enjoy plants for their intrinsic value, there are certain aspects to the naming conventions and ID that are important to understand and that can be used on a daily basis. So somewhere in school, you may have seen a chart. I'm sorry if that was blocking the screen. You may have seen a chart that looks something like this, where it is just a flow chart that shows animals kind of going cascading down this waterfall. And it looks like there's a common ancestor. Normally that's a single-celled organism. You may also have seen this, maybe it has words on it, where it just kind of travels across and it just splits off almost like a decision chart. So what are some definitions of taxonomy? Well, when I wanted to look up taxonomy defined, I saw that the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, uses this very long definition, which is plant taxonomy or classification is the science of naming organisms and placing them in a hierarchical structure. And all of this heavy text, and all I got out of it was plant taxonomy, something, hierarchical structure, I'm not really sure. And this assists with information retrieval. And so in order to understand this a bit better, I dove into the history. So as it turns out, the person who created the taxonomic system was a botanist. His name was Carl Linnaeus. He also went by Carolus Linnaeus. And he is seen here in this fancy old-timey photo because back in the day, in the early 1700s, he decided that the taxonomic system was too complicated. And by now, if like me thought it was the 1700s, it must have been a pretty simple system back then. Well, you would be sadly mistaken because a single species of tomato plant had the name Solanum, Caule, Inerme, Herbaceae, Folis, Pinnatus, Incisus, Racemus, Simplicibus. So that is a lot, and that is a mouthful, definitely. So this system was clearly messy at best, if this is the name of only one plant species, and they were still discovering plant species in the New World. So Linnaeus noticed this and decided to classify specimens based on morphology, which is the physical form or structure of an organism. Before that, people were classifying organisms by analogous or homoplastic traits, which basically were traits that appeared similar in function, but not form, and were completely independent or had completely different independent origins. So with this, birds would be more closely related to butterflies instead of reptiles because birds and butterflies can both fly. Dolphins and sharks are another example where they look the same, but now we know that they aren't as closely related as we previously thought. Linnaeus instead chose homologous traits, and which are traits that have the same form and generally stem from a common evolutionary ancestor. And even though Darwin wouldn't come around for another 100 years, Linnaeus was actually incredibly intuitive and classified organisms by their reproductive structures. There was an adage that even evolved that said, God created, Linnaeus classified. This system would later prove to be very accurate to the ancestral relationships once genetic testing came along to verify these. And so a definition that I also came across was phylogeny. And so maybe you've heard that term, maybe not, but it is worth noting that phylogenetics is also taxonomy, is a form of taxonomy. So I had a really hard time differentiating the two when I was researching because I kind of always thought they were the same thing, but they are not. Phylogeny's definition is the history of the evolution of a species or group, especially in reference to lines of descent and relationships among broad groups of organisms. So to be quite honest, in biology, sometimes I need the explain like I'm 5 years old version. So here's a difference simplified. Phylogeny is based off of genetic relationships, and taxonomy is like a filing system, and it generally uses phylogeny. So with future discoveries and the ability to genetically test organisms, taxonomy would change a bit. But we do still use the general taxonomic classification system as Linnaeus did. And the taxa or species groupings that we have kept are shown in red. So now we classify species into domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So with regard to plants, we can go down to subspecies, cultivars, and varieties. I like to think that this system is a sort of inverse pyramid with the most broad classification at the top and the most specific names at the bottom. So I know this looks very overwhelming. So there is a mnemonic device that goes along with it if you're interested, which is Dear King Philip, come over for good soup. So that would help to remember. And there are different taxonomic group endings if you want to get really specific, which is Ophyta, Opsida, Ide, Ales, Aca, and for the genus, there are multiple types, and for the species, it's generally a specific epithet or descriptor. And so you might be asking, why are these in red? Well, these are relevant for today. Thankfully, there are only 3. So you might also be asking this, why not use common names? Well, I have a slide for you. The first reason that we don't tend to use common names a lot, at least in the scientific realm, is that, as you might have guessed, humans are organizers and they tend to be they tend to want things in classifications. So it's more simple and more organized to create this kind of system. The second reason is just like common sense. It turns out common names are not so common. Names can often vary within different geographic regions, across languages, or even individual preference, and can lead to misidentification, or sometimes even a delay in proper identification of a toxic plant. All this can get confusing, especially when you're trying to do something so important as identifying a toxic plant. Obviously, for mushroom hunters, for instance, this type of specific identification can also come handy as well. Obviously, mushrooms are not plants, but it does apply to broader groups outside of plants. Some species are given one name for multiple species. For example, most people know ironwood as Ostrea virginiana here on the left, but another species, Carpinus caroliniana, is also called ironwood. To further complicate it, many species were just called ironwood because their wood density was heavier than water. And some species are given multiple names for one species. For example, Tupelo and sweet gum, they are both liquid ambar styraciflua. It doesn't help also to be able to relate species to one another. For example, you wouldn't necessarily know that pecans are in the hickory family. So also, when you see a name at a nursery and someone recommends a quote red maple, you don't want to end up with maybe a Crimson King Norway maple above that looks pretty different from the red maple shown, that is Acer rubrum, shown below. If hyphenated or run together, longer common names actually can indicate a few things, however. They can indicate that the common name is misleading. For example, Douglas fir is in the pine family, and it is not an actual fir. Box elder is a type of maple, and so you can see that in the Latin name there. And mountain ash is not actually an ash, since it is in the Rosaceae family and the Sorbus genus, and ash trees are in the Oleaceae family and the Fraxinus genus. I have included the pyramid at the top right as a reminder of how the family, genus, and species tend to go into from least specific to more specific. So what are you looking at whenever you actually see those italicized names, maybe at a park or maybe at a museum somewhere? Thankfully, we do not have to say the whole list for each species when we want to specify the name. Because of the taxonomic system, Linnaeus basically created a species filing system. He used binomial nomenclature, or a naming convention where we use two names and only the good soup or genus and species description, the species description, are used to refer to one species. So this is why those scary looking Latin names are actually not so scary. The genus and species, the genus name along with the species epithet allows us to know the rest of the upside down pyramid with just two names. These two names function almost like first and last names. So you can imagine if the species epithet is a first name and you just see rubrum, well, you don't, if someone just called me, if someone was trying to describe me as Sydney, they wouldn't, and there were multiple Sydneys, they wouldn't know which Sydney it was. I have the last name Young. So it's the same thing in these species descriptors, which is if you know that it's rubrum, you don't know what it is, but if you say it's Acer rubrum, you know what it is. So these names function similarly. Just like many names, there is a convention of writing them. The genus is capitalized and the species is lowercase, and the whole word is italicized. So the genus is the capitalization and the species epithet. I'll correct myself there. So both of them together make the species name. And so the whole word is italicized, and it's just that simple. So for example, red maple would be Acer rubrum. Acer is the genus and rubrum is the specific epithet. That means red. So, and an epithet is not to be confused with an epitaph. Sometimes these family names can be significant ecologically or culturally. These can identify species that are ecologically or culturally significant just by knowing the family level. For example, Cupressus and Juniperus are both drought hardy and shade intolerant, but this does not apply to Thuya and Chamaecyparis. For example, this is why I've added that pyramid again, is that the family can describe some species of the genus, but not, or some parts of the genus, but not all. So as far as the genus goes, you're getting down to a more specific level, and you have more probability of covering similar characteristics. So it's more likely that that the genus is more ecologically or culturally significant. So for example, most oaks, which in the Quercus genus, are drought intolerant. And I put that Quercus SPP because that is just, that is shorthand for species. And it is generally used whenever you're trying to say that you know that that plant is in that genus, but you're not exactly sure what species it is. So, and genus plural is genera. So the specific epithet needs to go with the genus to make a species name. So for some examples would be alba, rubrum, or rotundifolia even. And this means alba means white, rubrum means red, and rotundifolia means round leaves. So some examples down below for a specific epithet would be virginiana. So as you can see, there are a lot of species with the same specific epithet, but they are different species. So below we have Austria, Pinus, Quercus, and Juniperus, which are all on the left, and they are all, that is the genus name, and virginiana is the specific epithet. I also wanted to distinguish a variety versus a cultivar because I feel that is important if you're curious in identifying plants at our nursery, for instance. If a variety has slight differences that will probably show up again when that species is bred. A cultivar is basically a clone of the parent since it is genetically identical to the parent and is reproduced through cuttings, grafting, or tissue culture, for instance. This can be a good or bad thing depending on the species, since it does not enable genetic diversity. It can be bad if a disease comes around and the cultivar is susceptible to that disease, or it can be good if the species is resistant to that disease or other environmental factors such as heat or drought. I won't go too far into naming conventions for these, but if you see VAR period or CV period, then that can indicate a variety or a cultivar. And as far as hybrids go, I also won't get too far into the weeds with this, but genetic crosses between species happen. And so there are rarely crosses between genera, which means multiple genus types, but it happens. It's indicated by an X, and it can be human or natural. So how would creating this quote filing system tie into ID? Well, when you see some Latin names, it can actually give an indication of a few things. The first could be the history of who named or quote discovered it. For example, if you see an L period after a species, that is Carl Linnaeus. I put a quote around discovery because obviously a Western person was not the first to discover many of these species, but rather they were the first to discover how they fit into the Western idea of a taxonomic tree. The second could be location. So for example, Quercus virginiana, that can be found in Virginia among other places on the East Coast. Knowing the name can help you know some of the physical characteristics or morphology of a tree. For example, it can help to know what the tree will look like and sometimes how big it will get or how it reacts to the environment. The more precisely you classify taxonomically, meaning the farther down that classification system you go, the more precisely you can predict these things. Another could be phenology, which is the timing of seasonal or natural events. For example, Prunus serotina or black cherry tree. Serotina or serotinous means late coming and refers to the flowers that open in the late afternoon. Names can sometimes change with new information. So this is not a perfect system because the names can change, such as maples. Maples used to be in the Aceraceae family. Now they are in the Sapindaceae family, and that was news to me as of a week ago. And the same evidence sometimes can lead to different conclusions. This is because we don't necessarily always have the genetic information from other plants to test it against current maybe species that are not extinct today. So let's take another look at that really long definition. Taxonomy defined again would be plant taxonomy, or classification, is the science of naming organisms and placing them into a hierarchical structure, each level being given a name. Arranging scientific plant names in a hierarchical classification allows related organisms to be classified close together. For example, all true pines are in the genus Pinus, and this assists with information retrieval. And so in summary, we went over the history of the taxonomic system. We learned about good soup, which is the family, genus, and species. We learned that this system can be less confusing, but even though it is less complicated, it is still a little bit complicated. So are there any questions?
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Sydney. I will bring up my slide again. I'm gonna take host back from me. I'm gonna steal it back. And I'll put this slide up just so that if you do have questions, you have our contact information. You know, obviously, as I said, this webinar is recorded. So if you're watching this on the recorded version and you don't have a chance to ask the questions live, please feel free to reach out to us at our email, info@savannahtree.com, savannahtree.org. We have some really wonderful resources on our website, including a list of native tree species with their scientific names, so you can test yourself there on our website. And we also have our phone number as well, if you just want to reach out and ask us some tree questions. We always love talking trees. So I'll give it just a minute here in case anybody has any questions. And we appreciate you all attending our webinar today and meeting our new field manager. Let's see, open up our chat just in case we get any questions. And while we're waiting, in case there are any questions, just as a reminder, we are continuing our Tree Talks program. So this will run every second Tuesday of the month. Let us know if you prefer this time of day. We are thinking about maybe doing evening webinars. So if it's easier for you to attend in the evenings rather than a lunchtime webinar, please let us know. We are evaluating, when we actually hold these webinars to make it more effective for folks and easier to watch. But as I mentioned, it is recorded and we will have that up later this week. So if you know someone who couldn't make it and really wanted to watch, you can send them the YouTube link. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions. Yeah, Jody says, thank you, Sydney. Terrific presentation, great content. It's a great review of taxonomy for me. It's wonderful. Yeah, taxonomy is fun. It can be a lot to go through, but it can be really helpful, especially those confusing ones that have multiple common names or the same common name for different species. So it's always good to know a little bit of taxonomy. But all right, well, thank you, everyone. We're going to close out our webinar. We are so happy everyone was able to attend today. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And hopefully we'll see you at next month's Tree Talk. All right, take care, everyone.